Well, good morning, everybody. We've got an important topic today, so I'm not surprised we've got pretty close to a full house and a wonderful speaker. So thank you for joining us this morning. We are here today at a humanist meeting, and just as a brief definition of what does that mean? Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives. We use reason and empathy to guide our decisions and actions. We live meaningful lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge what humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for world peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. We do have a reading this morning, and that's
This was done, written by Deidre Sullivan, who's an attorney in upstate New York several years back. It's called Always Go to the Funeral. I believe in always going to the funeral. My father taught me that. The first time he said that directly to me, I was 16. I'm trying to get out of going to calling hours for Miss Emerson, my old fifth grade math teacher. I did not want to go. My father was unequivocal. Dee, he said, you're going. Always go to the funeral. Do it for the family. So my dad waited outside while I went in. It was worse than I thought it could be. I was the only kid there. When condolence line deposited me in front of Miss Emerson's shell-shocked parents, I stammered out, sorry about all this, and stalked away. But for that deeply weird expression of sympathy delivered 20 years ago, Miss Emerson's mother still remembers my name and always says hello with teary eyes. That was the first time I went unchaperoned, but my parents had always talked as kids, been taking us kids to the funeral, and calling ours is a matter of course for years. By the time I was 16, I had been to 5 or 6 funerals. I remember 2 things from the funeral circuit: bottomless dishes of free mints, and my father saying on the ride home, you can't come in without going out, kids. Always go to the funeral. Sounds simple when someone dies, get in the car and go to calling hours or the funeral. That I can do, but I think a personal philosophy of going to the funeral means more than that. Always go to the funeral means I have to do the right thing when I really, really don't feel like it. I really have to remind myself of it when I could make some small gestures, but don't really have to, and definitely don't want to. I'm talking about those things that represent only inconveniences to me, but the world to the other guy. You know, the painfully underattended birthday party, the hospital visit during happy hour, the Shiva call for one of my ex-uncles. In my humdrum life, the daily battle hasn't been the good versus the evil. It's hardly so epic. Most days, my real battle is doing good versus doing nothing. Going to the funeral, I have come to believe that while I wait to make a grand gesture, heroic gesture, I should just stick to the small inconveniences that let me share in life's inevitable occasional calamity. On a cold April night 3 years ago, my father died a quiet death from cancer. His funeral was on Wednesday in the middle of the work week. I had been numb for days, and for some reason during the funeral, I turned around and looked back to the folks in the church. The memory of it still takes my breath away. The most human, powerful, and humbling thing I've ever seen in a church at 3 p.m. on Wednesday, full of inconvenienced people who believe going to the funeral. Thank you.
Oh, Preston, thank you so much for that. It's just a reminder that I just found that beautiful. It's not the grand things, it's those small gestures and how important they are. Being there. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was lovely. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. And the American Humanist Association has developed 10 commitments, which are a gentle guide that recognizes behaviors that follow humanist principles. Our topic today, Russia, Ukraine, a history of their relations, by Professor Chia Yin Hsu, incorporates the humanist commitment of critical thinking and global awareness. I feel really honored today that Professor Hsu has been willing to share this with us. This is Ukraine, Russia is such an important topic, and that you're willing to share your knowledge with us means a lot to me and to our group here today. And you can tell because we got a lot of people in the audience. It makes me happy. I'd like to now formally introduce our speaker. Professor Chia Yin Hsu is an associate professor of history at Portland State University. Her research and teaching focuses on Russia and Soviet views of ethnicity and nationality, and on the cultural history of money from the late imperial to the early Soviet era. Professor Hsu specializes in ethnic interrelations at the border of Russia and China, as well as in the mixed monetary practices of the frontier region. She has published in academic journals on cross-border encounters following Russia's expansion into China. She's also co-editor of 2 anthologies of essays on the cultural aspects of economic and monetary history. Professor Hsu, thank you so much, and we're looking forward. She will be taking questions at the end of her presentation. Yes. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the humanist group of humanists of Greater Portland, and Helen in particular, and
Joyce.
Joyce, who first wrote me to invite me to ask me whether I would do this talk, and I was very happy to do it. In a way, because I don't have too many occasions to do something like this, so I'm very happy to have a chance to do so. I want to thank also David DiNucci for connecting with me and giving me pointers on tech issues. And anyway, I thank you all for coming. And thanks in particular to the humanists of Greater Portland for being humanists. So my talk is titled Russia, Ukraine, a history of their relations or their interrelations. I wasn't quite sure what to call it. So in December 1922, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the founding of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union for short, marking the official end of 3 years of devastating civil war that broke out several months right after the Bolshevik Party took power in October 1917. From its very inception, the Soviet Union was structured as a federal state made up of distinct and ethnically defined republics. In 1922, the republics that made up the USSR were Russia, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republic. Other republics were then created afterwards, but I want to show you, let's see, share, what they look like. So, in all, the Soviet Union comprised of 15 republics, all right? So these are the 15 republics that ultimately joined the Soviet Union. And some of them are from the beginning, Ukrainian, Belarusian, or one of the first. And of course, the major one, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSF, SR for short. And SSR stands for Soviet Socialist Republics, right? So it's a good thing to know for your crossword puzzle. It always comes up, I noticed. And So, and then Central Asian republics joined, Caucasus joined, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on. After 1945, the Baltic countries became part of the Soviet Union as well, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, SSR, Moldavian. So this is the list. Subsequent, so this is really the list of SSRs that comprise the USSR. Why this peculiar organization, which in effect promoted the establishment of semi-autonomous governments based on ethnicity? Ethnicity, by the way, and its equivalent term in Russian, nationality, have been known to scholars of ethnic and national identity as something that were and still are notoriously difficult to define. What exactly is a nationality? What is your national identity? What makes you a certain national and not another? What makes you this ethnic person and not another? It's really, really hard to know where the boundaries are. Why organize the Soviet Union this way? The answer is twofold. First, it lies in the belief of Lenin and Stalin who shared with many late 19th century thinkers that ethnicity and nationality constituted an essential aspect of human identity, that everyone has an ethnicity. That's what they thought. This is, by the way, a view that most scholars today reject, as scholars now speak of such identity as not at all innate, but socially constructed. But in their time, they really thought everyone has an ethnicity. They just may not be completely conscious of it, or a nationality. Second, the second reason that the Soviet Union was organized this way comes out of a dilemma Marxists like Lenin and Stalin faced. Marxists believe that class conflict and class struggle are key to all change, all the changes for the better in human society. In their view, only by engaging in class struggle could revolutionary and social progress be achieved. In the late 19th century, however, many Marxists also saw that political movements built on nationalism both competed against socialist movements and could prove to be more attractive for the masses than socialism. Years before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, both Lenin and Stalin, aware of the burgeoning national movements across Eastern Europe, sought to understand the potential appeal of nationalism and the aspiration of asserting one's national and ethnic identity, and to find a way to diffuse nationalism's appeal. They understood that this was going on. They thought it was a mistaken idea of what people should be doing, but instead of trying to reject its validity, they tried to find a different way of dealing with the growing nationalist movement around them. In the case of Ukraine, national movements began to emerge, movements in plural, began to emerge after the 1830s as writers and poets such as Taras Shevchenko sought to reshape the folk idiom of the region into a Ukrainian literary language, which participants in this endeavor often equated with the development or the creation of a Ukrainian national language. So a literary language is very often thought of as a national language. But ideas of what exactly was a Ukrainian national identity was still very much in flux. Current day Ukraine is comprised of territories that in the 17th and the 18th century were lands belonging to the Zaporozhye Cossack Hetmanate, the Russian Empire, so the purple part is the Hetmanate, the Russian Empire, as you see is marked there, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. right? This is 17th, 16th, 17th and 18th century. After the first partition of Poland in 1772, which resulted in the annexation of Poland's Galicia by the Austrian Empire, the areas that Ukrainian nationalists would later identify as inhabited by Ukrainian people fell under Habsburg rule. Okay, so here, this is Galicia, both parts, Western Galicia, Eastern Galicia, and you have the borderlines of today's Ukraine, right? You see that, Poland in German, and Belarusia up there, Slovakia, and so on. But you see that Galicia, an important part of the place that Ukrainian intellectuals saw as the object of their national movement, was split between the Russian Empire. Today, well, actually, this was all Galicia was part of the Austrian Empire at the time, and then to the northeast of Galicia would be the Russian Empire. As of the 1860s, Kyiv was largely Polish-speaking, and Kharkiv was Russian-speaking. Ukrainian intellectuals debated over whether Ukrainians' national identity was to be associated with the Austrian Empire or the Russian Empire. So here I want to show you something. Oops. Here's another map that basically shows you, see Galicia here as part of the Austrian Empire. And so around the 1860s, Ukrainian intellectuals were split into several groups. There were those who call themselves Old Ruthenians, here they are, who were intellectuals who objected to the Austrian and Polish influence, to German language and to Polish cultural influence. They saw, Old Ruthenians were the ones who identified Ukraine with the Austrian Empire. Ruthenia is part of Austria. And whereas Ukrainophiles and Russophiles were Ukrainian intellectuals who objected to Austrian and Polish influence because neither the Austrians nor the Poles were Orthodox Christians. So they saw their identity as more connected with orthodoxy and therefore identified with the Russian Empire. The language policies of the Russian Empire at this time, however, worked to alienate both the Ukrainophiles and the Russophiles, as these policies, fearing and anticipating nationalist rebellions mimicking the Polish revolt of 1863, banned Ukrainian language publications and the use of Ukrainian in public institutions. That would comprise of these two decrees, the Valuev Decree of 1863 and then the Ems Ukaz in 1876, both had a function. After the 1905 revolution, however, rules about which language to use loosened up, and Russian Empire's language policy relaxed its control over the use of non-Russian languages, including Ukrainian. So Ukrainian language publications began to flourish. Schools began to be founded that use Ukrainian as the language of instruction, right? Because 1905, in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution, the empire, might say, liberalized and was forced to grant substantial civil liberties to many groups of people, including non-ethnic Russians, many groups of non-ethnic Russians. The Bolsheviks' direct encounter with what they thought was the power of linguistic nationalism in Ukraine occurred during the bloody civil war that lasted from 1918 to late 1922. They found that in many Ukrainian villages, peasants sided with the white forces. expressing their antagonism to the urban population, which tended to be Russian-speaking, and sided with the Reds. So in contrast, they sided with the whites. Lenin, Stalin, and their supporters learned from this what they call cruel lesson of 1919, because in 1919 was especially traumatic defeat for the Bolsheviks during the Civil War in the Ukraine, around these Ukrainian villages. That the Soviet state must earn the trust of the villages by promoting Ukrainian as the language of the public sphere. So that when peasants go to cities such as Kharkiv and Odessa and see that all the city signs are in Ukrainian, they would feel like the new government was theirs. That was the reason that they gave. And this is written about by historian Terry Martin. Thus, Lenin and Stalin's solution to the problem of nationalism was not to deny the nationalist demand of the right to self-assertion of each nationality or ethnicity, but rather to acknowledge the justness of this demand and to actively help fulfill it. Their hope was that once the right to national or ethnic self-assertion was granted by the government entity, nationalism would simply fade away, and popular energy would then be redirected towards the building of socialism. So rather than fighting nationalism, their idea was to help fulfill some of its demands, recognizing that nationalism, and these are my words, is a kind of sentiment of resentment of having been maltreated, right? So there's something to them. It's not, so there are two kinds of nationalism. There's the chauvinistic nationalism of a dominating force. That is the kind of nationalism that Lenin and Stalin would not condone. And they, in fact, identify ethnic Russian nationalism as chauvinistic. But they defined the nationalism of all the non-Russians as justified and tried, because they have suffered historic discrimination, right? So what to deal with that? Undo the injustice and therefore earn the trust of the people who might have gone over to the nationalist movement and bring them over to the socialist side. That was their concept, their idea. It didn't actually quite work out that way, but that was their idea. So against enormous, many Marxists thought they were completely misguided, right? Including other Bolsheviks. A majority of Bolsheviks thought they were misguided. Against enormous objection within their own party, Lenin and Stalin established the Soviet Union on policies of ethnic and national differentiation rather than assimilation. What this means on the ground is that the Soviet state was from the very start committed to the creation of, quote, not just a dozen large, here it is. So what they envisioned was that the Soviet Union would be created based on a policy of assertion of nationality. It would be a creation of not just a dozen large ethnicity-based national republics, but tens of thousands of ethnicity-based national territories across the entire expanse of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian and Kazakh Soviet Socialist republics are examples of the national republics formed. And the Jewish Autonomous Region, with its center at Birobidzhan, is one example of a national territory within the Russian Soviet Republic. This policy also means that in each territory, the national, that is, ethnic language, was declared the official language of the government of that territory, of the people of that territory. In dozens of cases, this necessitated the creation of a written language where one where such a language did not yet exist. And in part, Ukrainian was sort of in that situation. It was beginning to be developed as a literary language, but there are still a lot of variations across different parts of Ukraine, right? So there was not yet standardization, not sufficient standardization. And so that made teaching it a little bit hard. Also, the Soviet Union financed the literary production of that language as much as possible. That was part of the whole language policy. In the case of Ukraine, this means providing Soviet state subsidy for mass literacy campaigns based on the teaching of Ukrainian, or Ukrainization or linguistic Ukrainization is what it's called, for promoting Ukrainian as a literary and official language within the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and for supporting Ukrainian culture, music, art, cinema, folk tradition, and so on. In addition, this policy followed a principle called indigenization. This means that native elites, in this case, Ukrainian elites, right? In other case, it would be Kazakh or Uzbek elites, right? Were trained and promoted to leadership positions in the government. Have access to schools and industrial enterprises of these newly formed national entities. So they would be managers, they would be cadre, they would be filling positions of responsibility. Linguistic indigenization, in Ukraine's case, Ukrainization, proceeded apace thereafter, even through the 1930s, the decade when indigenous cadre and intellectuals and indigenous intellectuals in general, and Ukrainian cadres and Ukrainian intellectuals in particular, were mercilessly and massively purged and suppressed. All right. Even as they were doing this, the teaching of Ukrainian and the teaching of Kazakh was moving ahead. After the 1950s, however, even as linguistic indigenization continued to be advocated, the number of Russian language schools in non-Russian republics began to slowly increase. And this is perhaps because, in spite of everything, Russian language was the language of upward mobility. If you wanted to move up in the world, you would learn Russian. And if you have your indigenous language, you are confined kind of to your, it's okay, it's, Ukraine's a very large republic. But with Russian, you can move anywhere in the Soviet Union and up, sideways and up. But linguistic issues endured as a point of tension between those Soviet Ukrainians who wished to affirm and protect the preeminent status of Ukrainian in the Ukrainian Republic, and those who hope for the eventual merging of the diverse Soviet nationalities and ethnicities, such that differentiation ultimately by national identity would not really be so relevant and would fade away. This was in a way kind of what Lenin and Stalin was hoping, that in time, because the desire to assert national identity has been fulfilled, it won't be so strong anymore. And it would just fade away. And people won't feel the need to express their national difference. That was the hope. What does this all mean for the war in Ukraine today? It means that language remains a tool for manipulating and marking national identity, and that the fissures that developed in post-Soviet Ukraine emerged between the largely Russian-speaking eastern part and the Ukrainian-speaking western part. It also means that a national identity built on insistence on linguistic and by extension, seemingly cultural distinctions could acquire explosive power and could be enlisted in geopolitical contests. One such example is the case of Ukraine in the case of Ukraine, was the support given by the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC for short, in 1944, to the anti-Soviet pro-German Ukrainian nationalists, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN for short, led by Stepan Bandera, some of you might have heard of him, and its Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, that's the acronym in Ukrainian, to carry out espionage and violent underground operations in Western Ukraine between 1944 and 1947. According to historian Jeffrey Burtz, a retired Harry Rotzicke, a retired officer from the CIA's East European operations, confirmed that the US government was in the late 1940s supporting no less than 30,000 anti-Soviet Ukrainian rebels in Galicia with airdrops of medical support, supplies, cash, and wireless radio transmitters. Here's the quote from the interview by Jeffrey Burtz, or maybe another scholar. The overall purpose of our operation was to provide an early warning system about Soviet readiness for World War III, that is. An early warning system to tip us off if there were indications of mobilization in the area. That's what the Pentagon wanted. It was perfectly clear that they, the Ukrainian rebels, would not survive. So I added the italics to this because it's very clear that the CIA wanted the information, wanted to carry out the operation, the black covert operations, but didn't really care whether the rebels survived this endeavor or not. The Soviet government put down the ONU insurgents with much violence committed against them, and the UPA committed a great deal of violence, killing thousands and thousands of civilians who they thought weren't on their side. So violence was rampant on both sides. It was in the aftermath of the suppression of the Banderist insurgency that the peninsula of Crimea, a naval base on the Black Sea that was part of the territory of the Russian Republic, Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, was transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic by an administrative decree. Here is a quick glance at Crimea's background. So here it is. So Crimea was annexed by Catherine II into the Russian Empire after the Russian war with Turkey, right? And in 1853, the Crimean War broke out that actually drew in many powers, the French, the British, the Ottoman Empire on one side, and the Russian Empire on the other side, right? And some called it World War Zero. But that was the Crimean War. The Russians fought it, basically did not achieve victory, but didn't lose territory, didn't lose Crimea. So that's Crimea during the Crimean War. During the French, but it's a prize for other countries, right? So during the Russian Civil War, the French sent intervention troops into South Russia, including Ukraine and Crimea, and tried to take Crimea unsuccessfully. So when the USSR was founded in 1922, Crimea was set up administratively as an oblast or a region of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. In the 1930s, the Soviet regime carried out mass deportations of all the people it considered it could not trust in a war, expecting a war with the Germans, right? So who are the people they could not trust in a war with Germans? The German ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, ethnic Poles, Central Asian Turks who were thought to be much more sympathetic to the Germans, and Koreans on the Far East because they were thought to be sympathetic to the Japanese. So they moved, they were deported westward while the other people were deported eastward, right? Just to, move them away from their potential collaborators. In 1944, Crimean Tatars were deported because they were thought to be sympathetic to Germans, so they wanted to. So in 1950, right, and in 1944 was when the Ukrainian insurgent army was carrying out underground operations in Western Ukraine, not in Crimea, but in the area of Galicia. And suppression then and deportation left Crimea largely depopulated. So efforts were made to repopulate Crimea, and that included sending collective farmers to resettle in this region. They were ethnic Russians and they were ethnic Ukrainians. It was in the mix of all these moves that in 1954 that Crimea was transferred over to Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And some people thought that in a way it was also a kind of a consolation for the terrible repression that was carried out to put down the insurgent army just a few years before. In fact, that didn't end until 1953. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, its largest successor state, the Russian Federation, had looked forward, right? So this is all up to 1954. So I'm going to skip and jump over to after 1991 and with the breakup of the Soviet Union. At this point, the Russian Federation looked forward to a new geopolitical order that would transcend the divisions of the Cold War, East versus West, or communist versus capitalist, because they're saying we're capitalists now, so we should be all on the same side. This hopeful outlook was embraced by the so-called Euro-Atlanticists, right? Gorbachev himself voiced a similar kind of hope. Atlanticists envisioned a new world order based on cooperation of the former Cold War East and Cold War West, a cooperation that would stretch, quote, famously known as from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Not Vancouver near us, but Vancouver in BC. From Vancouver to Vladivostok, we will be all one unified, well, not unified, but cooperating kind of a set of polities, right? And this is what many Russians had looked forward to. Gorbachev did, Yeltsin did, and even Putin did at the beginning of his presidency. This vision began to vanish with the steady expansion of NATO eastward and with the NATO attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. As the Russian governing circles see it, NATO's continued expansion since the early 1990s breached the agreement Gorbachev reached with George Bush Sr. and undermined Russia's ability to defend its sovereignty. In addition, many Russians see Kosovo's separation from Serbia as an instance of NATO's contravention of the principle of territorial integrity in order to expand into Kosovo. In fact, Kosovo today, though not a NATO member, is host to a NATO camp. Just recently set up called Camp Bondsteel. At the heart of the question posed by Kosovo was, at which point should the principle of territorial integrity be allowed an exception and abandoned? When can you not observe territorial integrity? And that in the event, and also the question that in the event that there is a justifiable exception, for instance, the extreme repression of a minority, right, within that territory, at which point can secession be contemplated? And whether this secession should be a peaceful process, or that secession can be obtained through the use of force. Should secession, if it needs to happen, be obtained through negotiation or by the use of military force? When can you breach the territorial integrity of a country, right? So Kosovo told Russians observing it, they were extremely upset by Kosovo and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the secession of Kosovo from Serbia, right? So from Russian point of view, a Kosovo referendum for independence was promised. So it was supposed to be a peaceful process, a kind of democratic process by the US, but without the agreement of other UN nations at the castle where a set of agreements were signed on how to deal with Kosovo. And that castle is called Rambouillet. It's outside of Paris. So this promise by the US promised the Kosovars, right, that there will be a referendum without the UN, without the agreement of the other nations, other UN nations. This promise went against the intent of the Rambouillet Accords, signed prior to the NATO bombing campaign. During the bombing, this occurred in 1999, during NATO bombing of Serbia, right? The Serbian forces committed the worst of the atrocities against Kosovars. Thus, the Serbian atrocities, which might have been avoided had the bombing been avoided, not carried out, right? Had it not been carried out because negotiations were active, but because they were carried out, and that provoked Serbian atrocities. In fact, Serbian atrocities were an ex post facto justification for Kosovo independence. In other words, the bombing, NATO bombing, exacerbated the tension and the conflict between Kosovo and Serbia. And because it was so unhealable, the US could come around, then propose that Kosovo had to be separated from Serbia, right? But had it not been for the bombing, perhaps through treaty negotiation, other solutions can be found. And the worst of the atrocities in this conflict would have been preempted. But that didn't happen that way. So it seemed to the Russians, they were extremely upset by what went on there, because it seemed that negotiations and talks was not a priority for the US, which basically can ignore what the UN members voted on. So to many Russians, while the Kosovar Albanians may have had legitimate grievances against Serbians, the process of bringing about Kosovo's breakup from Serbia, enabled by a NATO bombing campaign to remove Serbian forces from Kosovo, was illegal according to international law. So now let's just take that 1999 case and go to Crimea in 2014. In Crimea, to block NATO expansion into Ukraine, because that was really what was at stake around that time, Ukraine's promised eventual membership in NATO. The Russian governing elite perhaps applied what it believed was the lesson it learned from the example of Kosovo, that an aggrieved ethnic minority, in this case Russian-speaking Ukrainians, supported by external military aid, in this case Russia, could open the way for contravening the principle of territorial integrity upheld by international law. So it's been done before. It's been done in Kosovo. So why can't we do it, right? In February 2022, when Russian troops invaded Ukraine, the justification the Russian government provided was the defense of the Russian-speaking minority in eastern Ukrainian regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, what I want to do is to quickly go over NATO's enlargement since the 1990s. This is the first map, right? You see several colors. So the original countries were in the lilac, right? Norway, Germany, and so on. And Germany, East Germany became part of NATO after the unification of Germany. And then very quickly, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia and Hungary, and all joined. And then very quickly, then after that, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia also joined, right? 2009, the accession to NATO was promised to Albania and Croatia. And in 2017, the accession of Montenegro. 2020, accession of North Macedonia. In 2023, after the Ukraine war began, Finland became a member of NATO, and in 2024, Sweden did. So here it is, right? This is what NATO map looks like. So the purple is Ukraine, right? It's the gray is the countries that are not that don't aim to be part of NATO. That would be Switzerland and Austria. Serbia, not aiming to be part of Ireland, no. The red is the kind of counterbalancing organization, which is called I think it's CSTO. Okay, so let me just go quickly. So in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, the conflict that began in 2014 was, according to historian Ivan Kachanovsky, writing in 2016, a conflict fed by direct and indirect foreign, that is, mainly US and Russian intervention. It was, in short, a proxy war that took the form of a civil war. In the current war in Ukraine, Russian troops are directly engaged, so they're not really fighting by proxy anymore. The Ukrainian side remains a proxy for the US. Given the extent of US support, it remains a proxy of the US. It remains a proxy of the US. What Kachanovsky says about the Donbass in 2016 applies to Ukraine today as well. There was nearly perfect alignment of Ukrainian and US government positions concerning major foreign issues. Specifically, top US officials generally express unconditional backing of the Ukrainian government policies. And the US provided free of charge military training and military equipment to the Ukrainian forces. That's what Kachanovsky said. The war in Donbass from 2014 to early 2022 claimed 14,000 lives in the 8 years that it lasted. This is not counting those seriously injured or displaced. The war in Ukraine, according to New York Times in August 2023, claimed 500,000 casualties, deaths, and injuries. Since then, the news media sources have tried to pare down the numbers that you see, such that reports now often say Ukrainian deaths and injuries lie somewhere to the present day between 120,000 to 170,000, very different from the number of 500,000 given in August 2023. And this is not counting civilian casualties. For this war, this is a chart of how much the US has already spent since it started in February 2022. Okay, it's a total of 175 billion. 106 billions went directly to aid, and then more than 1/3 of it went into all sorts of ancillary kind of costs. This is very expensive to finance, very, very expensive to support, even managerially and administratively speaking, or something. I'm not really too sure why more than 1/3 of the aid, just went somewhere else. Actually, the Council on Foreign Relations has a breakdown of what happened to that more than 1/3, the $70 billion that didn't go to aid. But all the same, this is the amount that it costs. Against the backdrop of the US recent unilateral withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, INF for short, in August 2019, under Trump's presidency, and against the backdrop of the recent go-ahead the US gave the Ukrainian government to use US missiles to strike inside Russian territory, it is difficult to know what will come next. Talks and negotiations have been elusive and unproductive, as they were with attempts to come to an agreement, and equally unproductive were attempts to come to an agreement, for instance, at Minsk in 2015 to end the Donbass conflict that went nowhere, and with Russian attempts to speak directly to President Biden after he first came to office, January 2021, that went nowhere, and talks mediated by Erdogan, the president of Turkey, shut down soon after it began. And these were talks that started after the invasion in February 2022. The failed attempts at talks and negotiations might well have reflected US government officials and their advisors' view of the lay of the land in geopolitics. So this is some quotes from what they think. Russia, according to Jason Furman, a former advisor of President Obama, is basically a big gas station, as the country is incredibly unimportant in the global economy except for selling oil and gas. Right? We don't really have to mind them. They're of no consequence. Senator John McCain, building on this image, said in March 2014, after the Donbass conflict began, that Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country, and that the United States should be providing military and energy assistance to Ukraine and imposing economic sanctions on Russia amid the fast-moving situation in the Donbass region. If there's any way to look at the Russian Federation other than as a big gas station that has no importance and little else to offer, I'm not really sure that came to the minds of our officials. So here I conclude my talk, and I would welcome your questions.
So here's a question from Hank Rapp. How does bombing by NATO require the Serbians to commit atrocities? Can you kind of share that
I
thought?
would be happy to elaborate on that. It did not require the Serbians to commit atrocities. What I meant to say was that bombing on Serbia by NATO infuriated the Serbians. And since they can't fight back at NATO, who do they pick on when they were infuriated and angered? Right, so they picked on the Kosovars. It was a conflict that could have been diffused and could have been de-escalated. But NATO's actions, instead of diffusing it and de-escalating it, ended up escalating it. This seems to be what NATO is quite good at doing.
Okay. Do we have a question here at Friendly House? No?
I have number one, but it's
Yeah.
incredibly related. I'll go ahead and ask it. You can say I've just answered it or clarify. To do with the lesson that the Russians apparently took from NATO bombing in Kosovo, I was wondering if you would be willing to try to further disentangle the chicken and the egg cycle to do with Serbian atrocities on one hand and NATO bombing on the other hand. So you may not need to say anything more if you don't want to say.
Well, it's not an area that I really looked up in preparation for it. I thought of it as an illustration for some of the things I want to talk about. But what I could say is that in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Yugoslav Socialist Federative Republic broke up, and it was reformed as Yugoslavia. And that time was a period of transition for many people in the former Soviet bloc. It meant that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the breakup of socialist Yugoslavia, many people hoped that there will be democratization that come in the wake of the breakup, because these systems were sort of kind of elite controlled systems. And instead of democracy, in fact, those elite members of the elite that had been elites in the Communist Party remained members of the, they didn't call themselves communist anymore, but they continued to control the vast majority of state resources and state administration. And against the demands of the popular masses for democracy, one ploy that they used everywhere in Yugoslavia and elsewhere in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, was to basically say, well, actually, to foment actually ethnic tension. So remember that these republics are supposed to be, supposed to be governed by a singular ethnicity. In reality, all these republics in Yugoslavia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Ukraine are inhabited by many, many, many different ethnicity. It just kind of, there is one ethnicity that's given a preeminence called titular ethnicity, but there are many other ethnicities. So in the face of demands for democracy, the governing elites, what do? They turned people's attention to ethnic tension and say, look, you should be more worried. You Serbians should be more worried about what the Kosovo are wanting. You Croatians should be more worried about what the Serbians are demanding, right? And in fact, and this happened in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, pretty much all over the post-Soviet areas. And so it was a kind of ethnic tension that was stoked by the elites trying to stay in power. And it worked. It created a lot of ethnic resentment among people who only a decade ago were marrying each other. And so it was, the harder things were for people, the deeper the ethnic hatred that was expressed during this time. So yes, there was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of terrible deeds that was carried out between people, and the Serbians carried out many of them against the Kosovars. But that is not a permanent condition or an inevitable condition. What you can do is make it worse by picking one side to support, rather than bring the two sides to the table and say, what is bothering you? Couldn't you settle this? Right. NATO picked a side.
You were describing the Donbass war as if, it seems to me you were describing it as if it is something other than the invasion of Ukraine, which, as far as I can tell, has been going on since the Obama administration when the Russian took over the Crimean Peninsula, which had previously been part of Ukraine. So could you distinguish, could you help me understand why you are referring to something as the Donbass War?
So one historian called the Donbass conflict a civil war in Ukraine, right? That's Ivan Kachanovsky, and who's an Ukrainian historian. And so what happened chronologically was that the seizure of Crimea in 2014 occurred really in the aftermath of the what's called in Ukraine the Maidan Revolution, right? Remember that in February from in early 2014. And what it led to was the overthrow of the government that was elected and the president that was elected largely thanks to his constituency, his very large constituency in Eastern Ukraine, Yanukovych. And he was overthrown. From the Russian point of view, this was a coup d'etat, not a legitimate change of government. But the more important issue was that having seen Yanukovych leave the stage, the coup d'etat or the regime change or the overthrow of Yanukovych, however you want to describe it, led to protest, in fact, and objections, mainly from people in Eastern Ukraine, right? Because they elected him. And so conflict developed from then. And that was the beginning of what would later develop into what looked like a civil war because of the barrage of military aid that was missiles that was being shot into that part of Ukraine from Western Ukraine. The Russian government at that point, looking at the situation, decided that they had to act very quickly because, and so they seized Crimea to make sure that they would still have access to it. And the reason is because up until then, ever since 1991, Crimea had always been open to Russian access. That was the agreement, part of the agreement of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it was a base that was leased from Ukraine, but there was no thought that Ukraine would, at any point when the agreement was made, was going to become a hostile force. Now, remember when after 1991, there was some hope, even though many Russians hoped that NATO wouldn't expand. Some Russians thought that if NATO really were to expand, maybe Russia could be part of it, could become a member. So it was this hope of joining everyone together in a security, sort of an order-keeping force across the globe. And at the time, they thought they had a lot of commonality with the Western countries because they too were fighting terrorists. And so they should be cooperating with the US should be cooperating with them. And but in 2014, actually, there are different signals, right? There's 1999, then there's 2008, when both Ukraine and Georgia were given what's called the NATO Membership Action Plans, MAP, right? That told the Russians that NATO really wanted them to join and wanted to have them as NATO members. And so it kind of, I don't know if there were covert actions going on. That's hard to know now. But they tried to find ways to make the pro-Russian president Yanukovych be very electable by giving him very, very favorable economic and energy deals. That didn't work. He was overthrown. So they knew then that Ukraine may very well, in a very short time, be taken over, be under NATO control. It was with that realization, they decided to do something that looked completely illegal, which was to seize Crimea, right? But for them, their thinking is that once Crimea is gone, it is an extremely important naval base. If Crimea is gone, falls into the hands of NATO, which is not particularly friendly to, doesn't think of including Russia in its membership circuit, then that pretty much would be the end of Russian sovereignty, right? Remember, since 2014, there's been a lot of talk about regime change in Russia, right? There's a lot of thought about breaking up Russia. Russia is too big of a country, it shouldn't really be that big. Well, what do you think Russian governing elites think about that? They don't want to be broken up. So
Dr.
it's a
Hsu?
breach of international law. They understood that. But their question is, why is it when the US does it and when NATO does it, no one says anything? And when they do it, they get sanctioned.
Dr. Hsu, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to move on to the next one. Questioner number 2 here. Questioner 2.
Yes, you described the construction of the USSR in the 1940s, I guess. Was that a violence-free event? That is, did all of these countries decide, oh, we're all going to get together and join the Soviet Union, or was there a significant coercion involved?
You mean 1922?
Yes.
The formation of the Soviet Union. Well, neither, because it only happened after extremely bloody civil wars, right? So the main combatants in the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, which went from 1918 to 1922, were Bolsheviks and their allies, socialists, who were called Reds because they supported the Bolsheviks. And on the other side, the monarchists, the liberals, the Republicans who were not communist, not Bolsheviks, and they were sometimes included socialists among them. But most of them, very often, they were monarchists, right? That was the main fight. This fight got really messy and drew in many ethnic groups in their wake. Many ethnic groups took sides, right? Ukrainians took both sides. Kazakhs or Bukharans took both sides. And in the end, a kind of an attrition occurred that many non-Soviet, it turned out that people who supported the Soviets and the Bolsheviks lasted the longest. In part because for some reason, and it's difficult to know because the Bolsheviks were absolutely inexperienced in warfare. How is it that they managed to win against the monarchists who basically had to train military officers and soldiers on their side? Some people said it probably had to do with Soviet policies. They were always looking to see what is it that we have to do to win more people over to our side. So the language policy was one way. So it was not free of coercion, but on the other hand, they were offering incentives for joining the Soviet Union. And so it was really, really, actually, you should think of it as what they did was that they went around everywhere and started to form Soviets, right? Soviets are councils. Basically, they are socialist councils or workers' councils. And they used the Soviets as kind of their advance guard. Sometimes they'll be wiped out, but sometimes they would wipe out their contenders. So in the end, the last people who were left standing were the Soviets. The Soviets in Georgia, the Soviets in Azerbaijan, the Soviets and that's how, and when they was formed, and there's a lot of kind of horse trading also, right? So it's half coercive, half incentivizing. It was, the idea was always to say that, we have to stop fighting, we can now start building and reconstructing.
Thank you, Dr. Hsu. I've heard through the media that one main reason for Ukrainian cohesiveness is they gave citizenship, I think, to all the residents at one point, or maybe it was the opportunity to vote. what's your awareness of that?
I'm not too sure about that in a sense. I'm not sure. So it sounds like if you just go there, you can become a Ukrainian citizen, right? I don't think it actually works that way. I'm not quite sure that's how it works. But what I will say is that there is, well, so here's right now, the big question is about how cohesive Ukraine is right now, with a big dividing line between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. Surveys were done soon after the 2014 civil war began. And these surveys found that many Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens in Eastern Ukraine would have happily stayed in Ukraine, right, as Ukrainian citizens, if they were allowed to just continue to speak Russian, right? So they could go to Russian language schools, they can have Russian publications, Russian newspapers, watch Russian, sitcoms and all of that, right? In 2012, Ukraine passed a law, the Ukrainian passed a law basically guaranteeing that non-ethnic groups, non-ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine will be guaranteed their right to speak their ethnic language. And since then, the language policy, I believe, has hardened with a lot of anger coming directed against ethnic Russian speakers and hoping to take away. And so I think there have been attempts to sort of suppress their demand to speak their own ethnic language, right? So that's, I think, where it's at. But again, I think this is one of those situations where there might be a problem that could be resolved if different sides on the problem are willing to come to the table and make some compromises on either side, rather than, it didn't have to lead to separatism or breakup or sort of the compulsion of one group of people to start speaking a language they've actually never had to speak before. So I'm not, I think right now, I'm not too sure where the status of language laws are, but there have been a lot of, sort of dissatisfaction about ethnic groups, non-Ukrainian ethnic groups not being able to, not given their space to speak their own language.
Thank